presentation, I'm going to take you on a deep dive into hematopoietic stem cell transplant in treating MS. I will say, because it's quite a mouthful, I will abbreviate that just stem cell transplant. But I will talk about what that means. And so just to give you an overview of what we're going to do in the next 20 or 25 minutes or so, I'm going to describe what is hematopoietic stem cell transplant, specifically also what it is not. We're going to talk about the background and history of transplant in MS, look at the current data that currently exists, and where are we going in the future. So when I'm talking about hematopoietic stem cell transplant, this involves the administration of stem cells from the blood, that's what hematopoietic means, either from oneself or a donor. And we give it to patients in the setting of a dysfunctional immune system in hopes, as you heard from Dr. Corboy, that this is an induction or induces a long-term drug-free, symptom-free remission of an autoimmune disease. And so this was first utilized successfully in systemic sclerosis. This is a rheumatologic disease that unfortunately has no good disease-modifying therapies, and stem cell transplant has been shown in randomized controlled clinical trials to induce this response for long-term event-free survival in terms of a benefit a year out. So what is stem cell transplant? What is it not? So I am not talking about medical tourism, which happens unfortunately in a lot of foreign countries as well as the US. I am not talking about infusion of stem cells through the spinal fluid or through an IV in what is called stem cell clinics that are often kind of these boutique and bougie clinics that some people can go to. And, you know, there are warnings about these therapies. So if you go to the FDA website, they warn about these stem cell therapies that are unapproved and can be harmful and frankly illegal at times. So whenever you have questions, this website on the FDA can be a nice place to kind of refer back and just understand what the process is. So in the US, the FDA reviews all stem cell therapies and provides an oversight in the US. If you are considering treatment in another country, that does not apply. So you would have to look into kind of the regulations of that country. And so the FDA does review, like I said, everything in the US. So if you ever have a question, if you find yourself in a clinic where someone's talking about this, ask for the facts. Has the FDA approved this therapy or at least reviewed the therapy? And like I said, when you go to another country, be cautious. It's really hard to know if this is safe because the different regulatory bodies are different in other countries. Not to just put fear in people, but I just show this example here of an unfortunate case that came through our program of a patient with MS that went to Mexico, got an infusion into the spinal fluid and developed a rare infectious complication that has unfortunately limited her ability to receive some of the disease-modifying therapies later on in her course. So just, again, these things can be dangerous. So know what you're dealing with, ask questions, ask questions, ask questions. All right, so now that you know what I'm not talking about, I'm going to tell you what the heck I am talking about. And so here are the definitions. You can refer back to these as on subsequent slides so you know what I'm talking about in terms of autologous versus allogenic stem cell transplant. And so much of the focus today will be on this first one where I'm talking about high-dose immunosuppressive therapy. This is giving a conditioned regimen to a patient, such as a chemotherapy, and then using their own cells, autologous transplant means yourself, to reset the immune system. And you can see an example here on this slide how this works. Again, the patient is getting a medication to mobilize, push those hematopoietic, so those immune cells, blood cells out of the bone marrow. They are collected in the blood, and then they are set aside. The patient gets a high dose chemotherapy, wipes out the immune system, and then gets their cells back as a reboot to the immune system, okay? This is in contrast to allogenic stem cell transplants, where the goal is to replace the immune system. So think of it as you have an autoreactive, bad, dysfunctional immune system causing the autoimmune disease. You are replacing that with a donor. You can see on this slide, you have a donor that matches up appropriately. They go through the same process where their blood is collected. You pull out their immune cells. The patient has their immune system again wiped out with chemotherapy. This has to be even more aggressive chemotherapy than autologous, because you don't want any rejection issues. And so then that patient gets the donor cells, they're infused, and you're trying to replace that immune system. So when someone gets a transplant early on, like I said, you get this high dose chemotherapy, ablates the autoimmune cells, and then the goal later is to reset that immune system. And this slide here just shows an example of how those immune system, particularly those T cells, so these CD4 and CD8 are two types of T cells, how those change over time after a transplant. And you can see everything in red is basically a new, hopefully improved T cell. And so autologous stem cell transplant is used for a lot of severe autoimmune diseases, all within kind of different stages of research. And again, all of this is research. We are utilizing and looking into this in various autoimmune neurologic conditions. And I'm going to focus obviously on MS today, but you can see some of the diseases that are being explored on this slide. Rheumatologic diseases, kind of the best data is in that systemic sclerosis that I discussed earlier. And even in the GI field, so gastrointestinal field, they're looking at this for GI autoimmune disease. And so let's go look at the historical data first. So a retrospective analysis of 281 MS patients undergoing this high dose chemotherapy, followed by autologous stem cell transplant, was examined between 95 and 06. The early studies really looked at patients that were pretty disabled. So an EDSS is a way of measuring disability of patients. If you're looking at an average of 6.5, you're talking about patients that are using walkers or wheelchair bound, so pretty disabled. 78% in this group had a progressive form of MS. What we have learned is that through this observational study with the citation on the bottom of the slide here, that patients that did best were those patients with a lot of inflammation early in the disease course that had relapsing remitting MS. The patients with that more progressive stage did not fare as well. And so based on this, studies really kind of honed in and focused on that relapsing remitting disease. And you heard a little bit about this, or a lot about this, with Dr. Corboy talking about the stages of MS. Early in the disease, you have a lot of that inflammation, active demyelination, and then late stage MS, you have that accumulation of neurodegeneration over time. And so really, it's with autologous stem cell transplant, just too late in the disease course, really intervening in those late stages. So outcomes being poor, particularly with those primary progressive MS patients, whereas in studies kind of refocus, like I said, early in the disease course. So that takes us to this clinical trial called the HALT-MS clinical trial that looked at this high-dose immune suppressive therapy followed by autologous stem cell transplant in relapsing remitting MS. This study was designed as an open label, meaning patients came in and everyone got the transplant. It was a single arm. It was not placebo controlled. And it consisted of 25 patients. And the whole point, the objective of this study was to look at how patients did 5 years out in terms of disease stabilization and also safety. So the way it was defined in the clinical trial to figure out if patients had this, what we defined as event-free survival after 5 years, it was a combination of different things that we often look at in the clinic. Did patients have any clinical relapse? Did patients have any change on their MRI, particularly those contrast-enhancing lesions that would be indicative of active inflammation? Did patients have any progression in terms of their disease disability? So measuring that EDSS that I mentioned before, and of course, looking at any deaths, complications. And so with this clinical trial, it was shown that this stem cell transplant method was effective for inducing long-term sustained remission at 5 years. And again, looking at those different endpoints and breaking it down, you can see here on the slide, in terms of disease progression with that EDSS, only 3 patients with a clinical relapse, only 2 patients meeting a definition of relapse based on their MRI, and importantly, 0 deaths. This is just another way that of looking at this data, showing kind of those GAD enhancing lesions, so that active inflammation, as well as new T2 lesions on the MRI, where you can see at baseline more activity, and that decreases over the 5 years after transplant. So now we're going to step up our game here a bit. We'll look at a randomized controlled clinical trial, because really in medicine, that is our gold standard. So in this particular study, this was a randomized controlled clinical trial that looked at stem cell transplant versus patients randomized to disease modifying therapy. It consisted of 110 patients, 55 in each arm, and looked at how that compared. And it's important to recognize that this study, it was published in 2019. So when it was conducted, our disease modifying therapies, some patients included rituximab, but no patients with Ocrevus, no patients with the new anti-CD20s were included in this study. So the landscape, as you have heard, and you will hear from Dr. Wolf a little bit more, have changed. So this doesn't answer all of our questions. Also, for patients that were in this study for disease modifying therapy, they just had to bump up in class if they had a relapse and were randomized into that arm. That bump up in class did not necessarily mean highly efficacious therapies. So what we saw here, there was minimal toxicity, which is always good for patients. Mean follow-up was 3.5 years. And there was evidence of no disease activity in that transplant arm by 80%. So looked pretty good. But again, it was not compared against perhaps our best therapies. But where do we stand today? So here are the recommendations from the National MS Society saying that autologous stem cell transplant may be useful in MS, particularly for those patients that have substantial breakthrough disease, despite treatment with highly efficacious disease-modifying therapies, or have contraindications for whatever reason to disease-modifying therapies. So what did they acknowledge? What do we know? Best candidates are patients under the age of 50 with shorter durations of disease. From the data that we have, the procedure should only be performed at centers with expertise, and additional research is needed to really know what that best mobilization, best immune condition regimens, so that chemotherapy regimen that I talked about to wipe out the immune system, the verdict is still out. Things have changed through the years. There are safer ways of doing that. And what is the best, I think, is still not completely answered. And so where are we now? There is a randomized controlled clinical trial looking at autologous stem cell transplant versus the best available therapy. This includes your anti-CD20 therapies, which were missing in that prior study. And this is being funded by NIH. We are one of the participating sites, partnered with our colleagues over at CBCI, or Colorado Blood Cancer Institute. And the major questions to be addressed in this study is assessing that high dose immune suppression or conditioning. Like I said, we're still learning about that. And really, how does this pair to high efficacy treatments? If anyone is interested, this is a multi-center study across the United States. So I did not choose, this was from the this website for Beat MS. So I did not choose green on green. So I apologize if this is hard to see. I was not tech savvy enough to change that from online, but you guys have the handouts if anyone is curious or interested in looking into that. So what about primary progressive MS? Unfortunately, that has been left behind in where we are right now with our current clinical trial. Going back and looking at some data that is not published yet, but from some of our hematologic colleagues, there is some suggestion that maybe allogeneic stem cell transplant perhaps could play a role. And this really comes from looking at patients that had MS that unfortunately also had a hematologic malignancy and received an allogeneic stem cell transplant for their hematologic malignancy. Going back and looking at retrospective data, those patients actually fared pretty well in terms of their MS after their cancer was treated. And now the field has come a long way. Our hematologists have worked very hard, and the approaches that they take with allogeneic stem cell transplant are less toxic than they have been in the past. So allogeneic is much more dangerous than autologous in terms of side effects. You're getting donor cells, so there's always a risk of rejection, things called graft versus host. Those have improved over the years. So with that shift in terms of risk versus benefit, we can now perhaps explore, and there's a protocol under development that has been reviewed by the FDA already with an approved IND to look at allogeneic and primary progressive. And then beyond stem cell transplant, there are new therapies that we call CAR-T therapies, and they're chimeric antigen receptor T cells. That's a mouthful. That's why we say CAR-T. And these treatments were first utilized in cancer. But now we're looking and exploring this in autoimmune disease with just a recent publication showing benefit in lupus, which is a rheumatologic autoimmune disease that was published just, I think, maybe 2 months ago or even less than that in the New England Journal of Medicine. And so how does CAR-T therapy work? Here's a little diagram to try to summarize this. So you take a person, take a blood sample, take their T cells out, genetically engineer those T cells so they express these little proteins on the outside that go ahead and you give them back to a patient, and that is their T cell was re-engineered to target at first a cancer, but now target basically something in the immune system to change the autoimmune disease. And so for MS, they are using what we call CD19, which is related to those CD20s. The CD19 that will, you change a T cell, you target that, and it works very similar to those CD20 therapies, but perhaps more effective because it's targeted, you're taking out the lineage a little bit more. And the thought is, you might, with the drugs, only be hitting those circulating immune cells, whereas in this, it penetrates down to those lymph nodes. In a mouse model, which humans are not mice, and so, you know, there's always still some questions, at least there proved to be some benefit in a clinical score of a mouse, as well as just looking at the immune cells themselves, the target seems to work. So where we are with this in humans, like I said, this may be more effective at targeting those B cells, especially in those lymph nodes. When you compare it to anti-CD20 therapies, we don't know what this looks like in humans. So we start with what we call a phase 1 trial, which means, you know, we're not looking to see if this is efficacious or it changes the clinical course of MS, but number one, phase 1 means, is it safe? So this study is going to look at safety and the proper dose that we need, looking at a CD19 targeted CAR T therapy for MS. And this is currently underway and in development, and something we will be participating with here along with our colleagues at CBCI. So some take-home points here. There are good regulated studies ongoing in stem cell transplant for MS, medical tourism, boutique clinics, places that have to advertise stem cell treatments as, again, kind of a bougie new therapy or not these studies. Always ask questions, ask. You are the patient, you have the right to ask questions. Has the FDA reviewed the treatment? And then just to leave everyone with kind of a feeling that the future is bright. There is ongoing research. There is less toxic side effects to some of these new procedures for allogenic stem cell transplant. So, you know, perhaps we will have something for progressive MS, and there are new targeted methods like the CAR T therapy that are on the horizon. Thank you.